Stan will be doing the floor show in the bar tonight at 7. Our next speaker is Bruce Fein. Bruce began the Reagan administration as Associate Attorney General in the Department of Justice before he became General Counsel for the FCC, and then was on the Hill working with the Joint Congressional Committee on Covert Arms Sales to Iran. Between 85 and well, recently, you might be familiar with his regular commentary columns for the Washington Times. He's the chairman of the American Freedom Agenda, and is also currently a principal of the Litchfield Group. His most recent book is Constitution in Peril, The Life and Death Struggle for Our Constitution and Democracy. Bruce Fein.
Well, thank you. Following M. Stanton Evans is a little bit like following Demosthenes and hoping for an improvement. I want to discuss the final end of the state as the fundamental principle of the American Republic, and I don't think it's subject to debate. It was decided by those who fought at Valley Forge, later on at Cemetery Ridge, Omaha Beach. It's not subject to debate. And the founding idea behind our government, that to be distinguished from private sector activity, was that the final end of the state was to make men and women free to develop their faculties. The glory of the Republic was liberty, not empire, not telling other countries what to do. It was liberty. And that all those mechanisms of government should be measured against that goal. Does it maximize and promote the individual liberty to develop their faculties without predation on others, or does it subtract from that goal? The idea is one of human dignity. We're all captains of our fate. We need to be morally accountable for our own destiny, for good or for ill. We do not want to be dependent upon government by others to drive our trajectory. And to implement this idea of the final end of the state, we drafted the Constitution, whose foremost principle, really perhaps the greatest idea in the history of civilization, is due process. Due process, the first recognition by man that he could be wrong. You need to hear two sides. We need impartial decisions before anyone is deprived of life, liberty, or property. Due process, the beginning of civilization itself. It's something that has been tarnished, destroyed under certainly this administration. And to give an example of how truly frightening the legal architecture under which we live is, you can examine the Justice Department's views of the executive authority of the occupant of the White House to use lethal force on anyone who he decides in secret creates some kind of danger somehow, somewhere, at some future time, to some undefined interest of the United States. Now, Ken spoke about Nietzsche and God being dead, and I once wrote an article about saying, well, God is alive. He sits in the White House and claiming the power to kill anyone he wishes by his unilateral decree. You can't get any higher than that. Indeed, it's a more harrowing authority than has ever been claimed by any tyrant, beginning with Genghis Khan, Ivan the Terrible. You can't even think of endowing any individual with that authority of life or death to be made in secret on one individual's decision alone. This is the United States of America that overthrew King George III in part because he was denying Americans a right to jury trial. If you're a president, you don't get any trial at all. The second major principle in our Constitution that advanced the final end of government was the notion of the limited authority of government. Now, why was that choice made? The founders understood that men in a state of nature, given ordinary depravities, would do very antisocial things. There needed to be some government. Otherwise, as Hobbes remarked in his Leviathan, life would be poor, brutish, nasty, and short. But they believed that the even greater danger was a government that was not controlling itself. That all the evil individuals can do they are dwarfed by the evils that government can perpetrate. Whether it's Mao's 100 million deaths or Stalin's 80 million or otherwise, you all know your history. And therefore they devised this system of limited government by enumerating only certain subjects that the government can operate on. In the United States Constitution, it's largely Article 1. And even more important, in order to check the excessive use of those limited authorities, they developed the idea of separation of powers. Separation of powers based upon the idea that men and women are not angels. If that were true, we'd need no government at all. But ambition needed to be made to counteract ambition. Indeed, it was said in the Federalist Papers that the very definition of tyranny was the combination of legislative, executive, and judicial powers in one branch or one person. The very definition of tyranny that provoked the American Revolution. And I say we now have an executive branch that has been endowed with the authority to play prosecutor, judge, jury, and executioner to kill Americans. Every single branch of government combined in one. The definition of tyranny. Now, the response that the Constitution provided for such usurpation was simple. Article 2, Section 4 provided for impeachment and removal from office of those officials, including the President, guilty of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. And when the Constitutional Convention was discussing the impeachment power, Benjamin Franklin described it as a substitute for assassinating tyrants. The civilized way in which someone who has proven an untrustworthy steward of our liberties is removed from power. It's not the guillotine like Louis XVI. It's a civilized legal method for preserving our liberties. Now, unfortunately, it's used as something like HIV or AIDS. You just can't go near the impeachment authority. But that is the only check the Founding Fathers recognized that could contain executive branch abuses. Otherwise, it simply defies the Constitution with impunity if Congress will not step up to the plate. It was equally understood as a fundamental principle of our Constitution and our government was that we do not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. Those are the words of John Quincy Adams, then Secretary of State, in his July 4th, 1821 address to Congress. The Founding Fathers understood that there was an irreconcilability between permanent war and liberty. And James Madison explained that those powers that were initially conceived to address foreign dangers invariably come home to destroy domestic liberty. The Founders thus entrusted exclusively to Congress the decision to go to war, to cross the Rubicon from peace to war. A very momentous decision because, ladies and gentlemen, the defining earmark of war is it makes what customarily is murder legal. So it's a very, very important, careful decision that you want to make. It makes what's customarily murder legal. And therefore, Congress was given the exclusive authority to make that decision absent response to an actual attack because the President has a conflict of interest. It was recognized and debated amongst all the founders that in times of war, the President grows in power. The secrecy, the patriotism, the money, the appointments, the footprints in the sands of time. And if you looked at the history of war, it's been invariably initiated by executives, by monarchs, not by collective bodies. And this was one idea where those who were most in favor of the most muscular presidency, Alexander Hamilton, joined hands with the likes of James Madison, who was much more skeptical and said, yes, we cannot endow our president with the same authority as King George III or the monarch of England. And now we have a president who says, I can go to war unilaterally, anytime, any place, anywhere. He had his legal advisor at the State Department testify before the Foreign Relations Committee, We can blow up the world, and it's not war in the constitutional sense if it doesn't endanger our pilots or otherwise. We could send nuclear ICBMs all over the world. It's not war. I can do that unilaterally. These are just symptoms of what I would call a post-constitutional era. We are so far beyond the first principles of the Founding Fathers. It would be unrecognizable to those 55 delegates who sat in Philadelphia in 1787 and drafted what has been described as the miracle of Philadelphia. So far beyond that we are in danger of self-ruination if something is not done to restore these final principles. In my judgment, we have a shelf life of no longer than 20 years. We will be run by a single executive. We will be reduced to vassalage, and all of our liberties will be the political indulgence of the president, none of them that we will be able to assert as a right in federal courts. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is frightening. Thank you.